These charts, red and blue lines, tell a story that a million words cannot. Do you see the peaks on the right-hand side of each separate graph? This is a historical rise in the price of rents that Australia has seen. In fact, according to CoreLogic's Rental Value Index, rent increases in Australia are growing at the quickest rate in the last 15 years. Does Australia still need to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic on economies globally? Why are rents in Australia skyrocketing, and why is the impact not uniform across the country? Let's take a look. Do you know the not-so-fun part of journeying through Australia? As you cross this country, you'll come across a landscape that is as varying as its housing market. 31% of all Australians live in rental homes, while the rest, 66%, live in their own homes, with or without mortgages. Surprisingly, only 33% of homeowners are entirely mortgage-free. However, what if we told you that in 2021, the pandemic and rising demand for local accommodation caused rents to soar? This fire has been further fueled by immigrants from overseas, as well as the inflationary pressures and rising RBA rates. But why has this been the case? Well, before we tell you that, you need to have a snapshot of average rent prices across Australia. Imagine standing in Sydney, New South Wales, where the air buzzes with energy and opportunity. Here, the average weekly rent is a staggering $745, making it the most expensive capital city in Australia. The northern beaches, an idyllic coastal haven, command the highest rent at $1,167 per week. Meanwhile, the outer southwest offers a more affordable option at $518 weekly. As you venture beyond Sydney, rent costs drop significantly. Picture yourself in the far west of New South Wales, where the average weekly rent is a more manageable $404. Only Richmond Tweed on the Queensland border approaches Sydney's rates with an average of $702 per week. Now turn your attention to Melbourne, the centre of the arts and economy in Victoria. At $565 per week, the average rent is over $200 less than in Sydney. Given that Melbourne is expected to surpass Sydney as Australia's largest city, this is unexpected, isn't it? Now let's move north to Brisbane, Queensland. This is a city that balances urban life with natural beauty. The average rent here is $627 weekly, on par with many other capitals. In Brisbane's western suburbs, rents reach $744, almost mirroring Sydney's average. Beyond Brisbane, coastal allure drives up rents. Imagine living on the Gold Coast, where you'd pay $792 weekly, the highest in the state. Even the Sunshine Coast, with its serene beaches, demands $711 per week. In contrast, outback Queensland remains the most affordable, with an average rent of $410 per week. Next, we have Adelaide, South Australia. The average rent here is $565 per week, matching Melbourne's. The city centre and the hills are the priciest areas at $613 weekly, while the northern suburbs are cheaper at $529. In the Barossa York Mid-North region, you'd pay $400 weekly, and in the southeast, $420. The outback, with its vast open spaces, is the most affordable at $361 per week. However, the rent on the coastlines tells a different story. In Perth, the average rent is $630 weekly. The inner suburbs top the charts at $773 weekly, but other areas remain under $700. In the northern WA outback, rents soar to $862, contrasting sharply with the southern WA outback's $488. The Wheat Belt offers the most affordable option at $441 weekly. Now let's sail to Hobart, Tasmania. This capital city is the cheapest to rent in, with an average of $535 weekly. Hobart is unique, with rents decreasing by 3.5% annually. The rest of Tasmania sees rents under $500 weekly. In the west and northwest regions, you'd pay $410 weekly, while Launceston, the second largest city, averages $464. Canberra, the nation's capital, stands at the second most expensive city, with an average rent of $651 weekly. Despite its smaller size, Canberra commands high rents, reflecting its status and significance. Finally, in Darwin, Northern Territory, the average rent is $611 weekly. Although Darwin is small, its rental market is notable. Beyond the city, the Outback NT sees rents averaging $526 per week. After looking at all these variations, one may argue that the term crisis is overused in the media. However, there's no denying that the rental market has been hit by a perfect storm of problems that have resulted in affordability and scarcity difficulties unseen in Australia for over a century. Due to the exclusion of tenants at the lower end of the rental markets from affordable houses, homelessness has increased in Australia's major cities and smaller towns. There are very few rental houses available, even for the wealthy, and competition is very strong. When you combine increased migration, growing mortgage rates, and a sluggish supply of new homes, it's possible that the term crisis is overstated, as anyone wanting to rent a house would attest. How then did we arrive here? Let's go back to 2020, when the pandemic caused an abundance of social, cultural, and economic upheavals in Australia and throughout the world. Before we dive into the causes, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay updated with all the latest shocking truths. Imagine a moment in time when everything stopped and life as we know it abruptly changed. The COVID-19 pandemic altered every facet of our everyday existence, including our living arrangements and places of residence. Imagine the vacant offices, the lonely streets, and the growing need for privacy and space. Australians started to seek larger spaces and fewer housemates as social separation became the new norm, and the rental market was no stranger to being impacted by this change. Now visualize the numbers. The Australian Bureau of Statistics, ABS, reported that average household size declined during the pandemic. This resulted in around 120,000 additional households being formed. However, if migration wasn't possible, where did this all-new demand come from? Many people turned toward the rental market as they were eager for space and privacy. It was a time when renters, who typically had lower incomes, faced greater financial burdens. Think back to 2021, right in the thick of the pandemic. About 30% of Australians, according to the census, rented their houses on the private rental market. The ordinary renter was already devoting around 26% of their weekly salary to housing, which meant that renters were already paying a sizable amount of their income on housing. When September 2023 rolled along, that number had shot up to 31%. It was much more startling for low-income individuals, some of whom were paying up to 51% of their salary in rent. But why the sudden and sharp rise? Not only did the pandemic affect our way of life, but it also changed the nature of the property market. Rental costs started to rise as individuals dispersed and looked for more comfortable housing. As fewer people shared rooms, the demand for rentals increased, but the supply of available homes couldn't keep up. Imagine an apartment complex in the central city that was once alive with young professionals but is now deserted as people migrate to suburban or region locations in pursuit of greater space. Rental costs increased in formerly more cheap places as a result of this migration from urban areas. The need for privacy and calmness grew with the spread of the virus. All of a sudden, the crowded streets and small flats of cities like Sydney and Melbourne were no longer appealing. A large number of people fled the metropolis to take advantage of remote work's increased flexibility. Many were forced to relocate permanently in search of a new way of life rather than simply a short-term escape as a result of lockdowns in Sydney and Melbourne. If you look at the migration numbers during the pandemic, they're striking. Between 2020 and 2021, there was a 15% rise in the quarterly flow of regional areas compared to the preceding 2 years. The Sunshine Coast, Greater Geelong, Wollongong, Lake Macquarie, and Queensland's Gold Coast emerged as the most popular travel destinations despite the closing of state borders. But what happened when all these people moved? They required residencies. The rental market in these outlying locations boomed as more people chose to rent before owning. Consider a tightly inflated balloon that was unexpectedly released. Supply was unable to keep up with the demand. The market for rental homes became extremely competitive and the rate of vacancy fell. The sharp increase in rents was caused by this imbalance between supply and demand. Indeed, during the 2 pandemic years, regional rents in desirable areas skyrocketed by about 20%, illustrating the quick pace of change. The housing market didn't slow down, rather it exploded as the pandemic limitations lifted and life began to return to normal. Think of a spark striking a fuse. Tenant prices surged in tandem with the price of real estate. According to CoralLogic statistics, Australia's median rent increased by 9.1% year on average between 2021 and 2023, resulting in an astounding 27% increase. But that wasn't all that happened. When the pandemic was over, there was another surprise waiting for Australia's rent prices. The end of the pandemic reopened the gates to Australia's migration program, dramatically changing the scene. For the first time in over a century, Australia's population fell during the pandemic, highlighting the country's heavy reliance on migration for both population and economic growth. With international travel restrictions lifted, Australia's migrant intake surged, making up for lost time. The numbers are staggering. Between 2022 and 2023, a net 518,000 migrants were added to Australia's population. Most of these new arrivals entered the country on temporary visas. This influx predominantly funneled them into the rental market rather than the buyer's market, escalating demand and pushing rents higher. Imagine the vacancy rates in some markets dropping to nearly zero, making finding a rental a challenging quest. What does this mean for the future of renting in Australia? Another significant player in this scenario is the rise in interest rates. Picture this. As the Reserve Bank of Australia started increasing the cash rate from May 2022 to fight rising inflation, landlords began to feel the pinch. Interest rates soared 13 times, from a mere 0.1% to a substantial 4.35% between 2022 and 2023. Many landlords, facing unsustainable losses on their negatively geared rental properties, were forced to take action. To bridge the widening gap between their increasing mortgage repayments and the rental income, landlords began raising rents. With state and territory governments capping rental increases and even discussing rent freezes, some property owners chose to exit the rental market entirely. This decision had a profound effect in the 3 years following the 2021 census. Over 470,000 residential properties were sold to existing homeowners or first-time buyers, not other investors. This exodus of landlords further tightened the supply in the rental market. Now, the rental market has become a battleground, with supply dwindling and demand skyrocketing. Plus, buying a house looks like a far possibility. The combination of a surging population due to migration and escalating interest rates creates a perfect storm, driving rents higher and making affordable housing increasingly scarce. Is it too soon to think the worst for renters may be over? Data from the Reserve Bank of Australia reveals an uptick in the number of people per household, hinting at a shift in living arrangements. Demand for share houses rebounded to record highs in January 2024, according to flatmates.com. With migration numbers expecting to drop from last year's record levels, the landscape is changing. By the end of 2023, rent growth had slowed, and it's predicted to ease further alongside falling interest rates in the second half of 2024. How do you think this will affect housing investors and first-time home buyers? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video and watch more on the screen.